So the conference, the purpose of the conference was to look at the impact of the Syrian refugee influx specifically on various outcomes in Jordan, including labor market outcomes, housing outcomes, education outcomes, and family formation. The idea was to really isolate the impact of the crisis of the refugee influx from the overall crisis that the country is going through, which is clearly has affected the country negatively in terms of all of these outcomes, especially employment. And so, of course, people's perceptions tends to be that if things are going badly, it must be because of the Syrian refugees. And clearly, the Syrian refugees were a big shock to the economy, demographic shock. But I think what we try to deliver is that had the demographic shock not happened, had not a single Syrian refugee crossed the border, a lot of the negative consequences that people see would have occurred anyway. And that on the net, the effects of the Syrian refugee influx were limited. There were clearly some groups within Jordanian society that felt it a bit more than others, but that on overall the net effects were quite small. So for instance, in the labor market, there were some negative effects on poor, less educated Jordanians who are competing in the informal labor market with the Syrians. And with other nationalities. But in fact, they were already negatively affected by the migration of migrant workers from Egypt and from elsewhere who were operating in this informal market. And the Syrians seem to have much displaced some of the Egyptians rather than directly affected the Jordanians. On the other hand, there were some Jordanians who had skills and who have education who benefited in the labor market because the public sector expanded in order to meet the service needs of the Syrian refugees in education and in health. And we do see evidence of an expansion of education and health workers, especially among women, among Jordanians. And so that was an important result. So it was both a challenge and an opportunity in some sense. Now, in terms of education, again, we didn't see a lot of negative effects on Jordanians. There was an attempt to shield Jordanians by creating these second shifts in public schools, and where most of the Syrians would go to the second shift. But of course, there probably are some effects in terms of shortening the school day and some of the learning outcomes which we weren't able to completely tease out. And in terms of housing, that's the area where we saw that there were negative effects, and the negative effects were particularly concentrated among the low-income households who are directly competing with the Syrians for low-cost housing. And in fact, the richer Jordanians upgraded their housing as a way of kind of escaping from the type of housing that the Syrian refugees demand. And in the area of family formation, there were no direct effects of the crisis, although we did note that fertility decline resumed in Jordan, which is fairly good news. Now, in addition, there were a bunch of other more subtle effects. So, for example, it looks like Jordanians who were in the governorates that were most affected by the Syrian refugees left these governorates in certain numbers, and the mechanism appears to be escaping the school crowding and the high housing prices. But in fact, when you look at job location, the people moved in, the jobs increased in these governorates where you have high concentrations of Syrians because of the service delivery needs. And so on the one side, people moved out residentially, but were commuting back into work in these governorates, which were very interesting results. And then we saw a paper which saw very clear effects on other migrant workers, including Egyptians, who are competing directly with the Syrians in that informal employment space. So I think on the whole, the messages were interesting and clear. There's still some issues having to do with the Jordanian labor market itself, irrespective of the refugees, which have to do with very low participation rates among both men and women, among the lowest rates in the world among men, which is quite unusual, and declining. And that's a little bit of a puzzle. So we identified this group of even young Jordanians who are neither in school nor in employment, and we really don't know what they're doing. And in fact, it's across the age spectrum, and the Jordanians who are working are retiring early and increasingly so over time. So there is a puzzle about why the rate of employment in Jordan is as low as it is and declining.